From Studio 19, I'm Jeff Allen Wolf. This is A World Gone Mad. Okay, let's not waste any time. Here we go. Kuwait wasn't supposed to be the headline. That's what makes this story so remarkable. Iranian missiles and drones hit Kuwait's airport. U.S. military facilities in the region were reportedly targeted. People were killed and injured. Flights were disrupted. The United States launched fresh strikes, and we're still hearing the word ceasefire tossed around like it means something. At this point, calling this a ceasefire feels like, calling a house fire a minor candle-related incident. The flames are visible. Everyone can see them. Every few days, somebody steps in front of a microphone and announces that progress is being made in Iran. Diplomats are talking. Negotiators are meeting. Stability is the goal. Wonderful. Then another missile flies across a border. Another target gets hit. Another country discovers it's become part of the conversation, whether it volunteered or not. At this point, the ceasefire seems to exist primarily as a public relations strategy. Trump keeps talking as if the situation is calming down. We're told a ceasefire is holding. We're told things are under control. We're told the worst may be behind us. Then Iran looks at all of that and essentially says, nope. Missiles fly, airports get hit, U.S. military facilities are targeted, and fresh strikes are launched. And the conflict finds a new way to expand. For a war that's supposedly winding down, it keeps acting like it just got a second wind. And poor Kuwait keeps finding itself in the middle of a conflict it didn't ask to headline. Airports are supposed to be places where people complain about luggage, overpriced sandwiches, and delayed flights. They're not supposed to become front-page examples of how fragile a regional ceasefire really is. Yet, somehow, Kuwait woke up, found itself playing an unexpected supporting role in a conflict that apparently is becoming everybody's problem. My favorite part is when everybody involved assures us they don't want a wider war. That's always comforting. It's right up there with hearing, we've got everything under control, from the guy holding the fire extinguisher upside down. History is full of leaders who didn't want a larger conflict right up until they backed into one while insisting everything was proceeding according to plan. Every strike is described as limited. Every response is described as necessary. Every escalation is described as controlled. That's the word they always use, controlled. Yet somehow all these carefully controlled actions keep producing a situation that looks less controlled by the week. It's like watching somebody insist they're driving cautiously while pieces of the car keep flying off onto the highway. And that's the problem. Most disasters don't begin because somebody wakes up one morning and announces, today I'd like to create a catastrophe. They begin because people convince themselves they can manage every reaction, predict every response, and control every consequence. Then reality shows up, ignores the plan, starts writing its own script. Right now, the Middle East feels like a room full of people carrying gasoline cans while assuring everyone that safety remains their highest priority. Maybe they're right. Maybe this stays contained. But when airports are getting hit, U.S. military facilities are reportedly being targeted, fresh strikes are being launched, and new countries keep finding themselves pulled into the story, it's becoming harder and harder to tell where the ceasefire ends and the war begins. Donald Trump is completely in over his head with his war against Iran. The primary elections are still being counted from Tuesday, but we already got two fascinating stories out of Iowa and California. and neither one is particularly comforting for the political establishment. Let's start in Iowa, where Congressman Randy Feenstra, Trump's endorsed candidate for governor, lost to Zach Lund. Now, before anybody starts announcing the collapse of Trump's political empire, let's all calm down. Donald Trump's still the most influential figure in the Republican Party. But Iowa delivered a reminder that endorsements are not the same thing as votes. For years, a Trump endorsement has been treated like a political cheat code. If Trump backed you, the assumption was that your chances immediately improved. Then Iowa came along and reminded everyone that voters occasionally enjoy making their own decisions. I know that sounds like a strange concept in modern politics, where both parties often act like voters or characters in a video game who simply follow instructions. But that's apparently still how democracy works. The bigger problem for Republicans isn't that Trump lost. Trump wasn't on the ballot. The problem is that Iowa just introduced a question Republicans would rather not be discussing. Is a Trump endorsement still a guarantee, or is it simply a powerful advantage? These are two very different things, and political strategists are probably spending this morning pretending not to be nervous while quietly being very nervous. Democrats had their own reason to smile in Iowa. They got Josh Turek, the Senate candidate they wanted, and suddenly a state many Democrats had largely given up on is getting another look. Now let's not get carried away. Every election cycle produces somebody who sees one encouraging result and immediately starts predicting a political revolution. Usually that revolution lasts about as long as a New York or New Year's gym membership. Then there's California, where the early governor's race numbers produce their own surprise. Republican Steve Hilton is sitting ahead at this point of recording of Democrat Javier Becerra in the primary returns. Again, before anybody starts drawing maps showing California turning bright red, that's not what's happening. California still is one of the biggest, bluest states in America. It's also worth remembering that California uses a top two primary system. It doesn't matter whether candidates are Democrats or Republicans. The two candidates receiving the most votes advance to the November election. So if the current numbers hold as of my recording this, Steve Hilton and Javier Becerra would move on to the general election regardless of party affiliation. What ties Iowa and California together is that both states delivered a warning to their dominant political parties. Republicans in Iowa learned that endorsements aren't magic. Democrats in California learned that demographics aren't magic. Both parties have spent years convincing themselves they possess some permanent advantage. Iowa and California just reminded them that voters have a nasty habit of rooting political assumptions. And honestly, that's probably the biggest takeaway from the election night. The political class keeps trying to convince voters that the most important thing in America is defeating the other party. Meanwhile, voters are standing in the grocery store staring at the prices that look like somebody accidentally added an extra digit. They don't care nearly as much about the political chess match as politicians think they do. They want results. They want affordability. You know that word again. They want problems solved. Iowa reminded Republicans not to take voters for granted. California reminded Democrats not to take voters for granted. And if both parties are smart, they'll pay attention because voters seem increasingly willing to ignore the script. And when that starts happening, election seasons get very interesting very quickly. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent appeared before Congress and confirmed something that sounds like it came from a late-night comedy writer who lost a bet. The Treasury Department we knew apparently prepared prototypes for a $250 bill featuring Donald Trump's face. Not approved, right? Not legal, not authorized, just ready to go in case Congress changes the law that currently allows only deceased individuals to appear on U.S. currency. Now, if you've been listening to my show before, none of that should surprise you. We've talked about the reported prototypes. The difference is that now Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is confirming they were real and that Treasury was prepared to move forward if Congress changed that law. Now let's pause for a moment and appreciate what we're being told here. The Treasury Department has real responsibilities: the national debt, government financing, economic stability, currency security. But somehow along the way, somebody apparently thought, you know what we'd better get started on? That $250 currency with Trump's face on it. Just in case. That's like hearing your local fire department say, don't worry, we've handled all the emergencies. We've had some spare time, so we designed commemorative flamethrowers. According to Bessent, Treasury prepared the prototypes in advance because, as he put it, they do things ahead of time. That's reassuring. Seriously? Most agencies prepare for hurricanes, cyber attacks, financial crisis, or supply chain disruptions. Treasury was apparently preparing for the possibility that Congress might somehow decide American currency needed a denomination most people don't use, featuring a living politician who already dominates the news cycle every day. And let's be honest, the $250 bill itself is a fascinating choice. $250. It's such a random number, it sounds less like currency and more like a gift card amount somebody's aunt buys at Costco. And of course they said $250 in celebration of the 250th anniversary of America. The truly amazing part came when Senator Catherine Cortez Masto asked the obvious question. If Congress doesn't change the law about living people being on currency, will Treasury drop the effort? Bessent replied, of course, we will follow the law. Now, I want to point out to the Wolfpack listeners that we're applauding a government official for confirming that the government plans to obey the law. That's where we are as a country. The bar is now so low, it's practically a floor tile. Will you stop doing this thing if it's not legal? Yes. Thunderous applause, standing ovation. Somebody bring out a trophy. In fairness, that's exactly the correct answer. Treasury should follow the law. The law currently says only deceased individuals can appear on U.S. currency. If Congress changes the law, that's a different discussion. But the fact that prototypes were already being prepared before any law changed tells you everything about modern politics. We don't wait to see if something will happen anymore. We skip directly to the merchandise table. And that's what makes this story so perfect. Not because a Trump $250 bill is necessarily coming. It probably isn't. It's because somewhere inside the federal government, people spend time preparing for a hypothetical piece of currency featuring a living president, while the rest of America is trying to figure out how much eggs, rent, and groceries cost this week. If nothing else, it's a reminder that in Washington, even the things that sound like punchlines sometimes turn out to be real. All right, major story. I want everyone to pay attention, please, because this is very, very important. All the stories were important, but this one is really heavily affecting us in the future. Scott Pelley, one of the most recognizable journalists in America and a longtime face of 60 Minutes, was fired by CBS after a clash with the network's new leadership. Following his dismissal, Pelley released a detailed statement defending the legacy of the program and sharply criticizing the direction of the network under new ownership. And I urge all the listeners, please read Scott Pelley's comments verbatim. I'm going to give you the essence, okay? In his statement, Pelley describes 60 Minutes as one of the most successful and influential programs in television history, built on decades of audience trust, journalistic integrity, and global reach. And Pelley makes the argument that the responsibility passed to him and his colleagues was to preserve those values while adapting to a rapidly changing media environment without breaking the foundation it was built on. So the baseline here is not confusion, it's legacy. And according to Pelley, that's exactly what is now being challenged. Pelley alleges that the network, CBS, their new ownership, is abandoning that legacy, writing that the program has been cast aside in a way he links to political considerations involving the Trump administration. Direct statement from Pelley. Pelley states that senior leadership and key correspondents were removed without cause, describing it as a loss of the program's DNA, not just personnel changes, but structural removal of the people enforcing standards inside the system. And once you frame it that way, the implication is already doing more work than the sentence. Pelley further claims that under new CBS management, he was instructed, listen carefully, Wolfpack, he was instructed to include false or misleading assertions in a politically sensitive story, material he believed was unverified, and he says he refused or ignored those instructions. Pelley also raises concerns that politicians have been given influence over interview arrangements, which he argues undermines long-standing journalistic standards. You understand what he's saying? The politicians were allowed to pick who interviews them. Pelley goes on to describe internal dysfunction, including production breakdowns that nearly prevented a broadcast from 60 Minutes airing on time. And he portrays the leadership environment as increasingly unstable and operationally broken. So now the question shifts from personnel to process. Because Wolfpack, if Pelley's claims are accurate, you aren't looking at a newsroom disagreement over tone or editorial style. You're looking at whether the boundaries that separate verification from influence are still being enforced inside of one of the most powerful news programs in the country. Scott Pelley is not an outside critic. He's a 37-year CBS broadcast veteran and a defining face of the network, somehow who worked inside the system. He's now describing as fundamentally challenged from within. CBS leadership has framed this as a breakdown in trust that made the relationship with Pelley unsustainable. Companies do part ways with senior figures all the time, but their explanation does not address the substance of what Pelley is alleging. Nobody's talking about missed deadlines. Nobody's talking about ratings. Nobody's talking about his competence. The dispute centers on editorial independence, political pressure, and whether unverified material is being pushed towards broadcast standards inside one of the most influential news programs in the country, 60 Minutes. And every time a journalist raises concerns about pressure, it gets dismissed as bias. Every time a newsroom fights over editorial control, it gets reduced to politics. Every time reporters question what is being inserted into a story, it gets brushed off as internal drama, so the pattern itself becomes part of the story. Because what Pelley is describing happening from CBS with 60 Minutes, if accurate, is not just tension inside a newsroom. It's a system where verification and influence are no longer cleanly separated, and where the internal fight is no longer about packaging or presentation, but about what is allowed to exist on the air at all. And at a certain point, it stops being a debate, starts resembling something out of George Orwell's 1984 book, where the fight is no longer about journalism at all, but about who gets to define what reality is allowed to be broadcast. And here's a late story that came across my desk before I recorded. The House adopts war powers resolution to rein in Trump on Iran. 4 Republicans joined Democrats to limit Trump's war powers in Iran. Now, something is coming of this, or rather, let me restate that nothing will come of this unless the Senate also votes the same way and agrees with the House. But this is something to keep an eye on, Wolfpack. If you've enjoyed the podcast, found it informative, maybe got a laugh or two, then please contribute to keeping this podcast around. I'm not backed by corporate media. There's no outside money other than my own wallet. So if you could please contribute to the GoFundMe, even a small donation makes a difference. The GoFundMe link for this podcast is in the description below the episode notes. I'm Jeff Allen Wolf. This is A World Gone Mad. I'll be back Friday. Until then, I urge you, the Wolfpack, remain skeptical. Question everything. Please don't lose hope. And most of all, stay alert.